Hey guys, it's your boy, the voice of it is 22 here. So, my sister, then my roommate got strep, and my throat feels kinda like it's gonna close any day now. So by the time you hear this, I will most likely have it. So be sure to enjoy the video. I'll be reading all your lovely comments while I choke and die in bed. Later. Most people have a relic from their childhood they can't keep around. Maybe it's a beloved toy they can't bring themselves to throw away, or a happy memory to keep in their wallet. Maybe it's a scar from some silly mistake, or worse, the wounds that can't be seen, the ones that hide on the inside, something that has shaped who they are, quirks, passions, fears. We all have something we keep. Mine is a dark wooden box. I hate that fucking box. I hide it away, stuffed at the back of my bottom drawer, wrapped in a tea towel so I don't even have to look at it. And my husband doesn't know why I refuse to have walnut laminate flooring in our dining room. It's because it reminds me of that box. Well, today he found it, and I don't know what to do. I freaked out. There are a million ways I could have handled it better, but I panicked. I saw the wood, I saw him reach for the clasp, but I actually scratched his arm pretty badly without meaning to. I've managed to convince him to just drop it for now, but I know he thinks I'm crazy. And worst of all, I know that the moment I leave this house, he's going to try and find it, and look inside. And then what? I suppose I should explain. Growing up in the 80s wasn't easy. Not for my brother and me, at least. To this day, I still don't know for sure what my mother did for work, though I have my suspicions. What I do know is that we were as close to poverty as it's possible to get without moving outdoors, or out of mainland Europe. Most people dismiss Liverpool because of the funny accent, but it has darker shadows than anywhere I've ever been in my life. There's a story about a man who traveled the world on his bicycle, visited every country, and then returns to England, only to get his bike nicked in Liverpool. That says it all. Just like any city, it's got its nice parts. Then there's the underbelly, where the scroats live. Well, we were the scroats. Me, my big brother Jacob, and our occasional mother. Looking back, it was a lot like having a cat. She'd come when she wanted something, leave whenever she liked, and occasionally bring us gifts we didn't appreciate or want. Cats bring dead birds. My mother brought gold watches, cigarettes, and pool noodles. I was 7 years old, and I loved her so very, very much. With no father and an infrequent mother, Jacob had no choice but to become the man of the house. I say house. It was a one-room bedsit with a mattress on the floor. Jacob was 20 years old, and whilst he always seemed like a giant to me, he was too young and scrawny to mix with the bigger kids on the block, especially with a younger sister in tow. So we stayed in the flat most of the time, garnering annoyance and sympathy in equal measures. Our flat was 4 stories high and filled with all sorts of wonderful characters you'd cross the street to avoid. There were bad ones, like the old man we only ever knew as Mr. Creepy. There were good ones, like Miss Cooper, who would give us food whenever we passed her door. But my absolute favorite was a rather large Jamaican lady who called herself Mama Jane. She had an accent that was thick as treacle, and owned the shop at the bottom of our flat. Mama Jane's shop was the kind of bric-a-brac weirdo museum you just don't see on the high street anymore. And since she didn't mind our company, it became our adoptive home. Whilst the shop sold any type of item you can imagine, Mama Jane had a particular fascination with dolls. If it was a miniature and had anything resembling a face, Mama Jane would buy it, display it in her shop window, and pronounce it was not for sale. Even those racist little goily doilies that people used to collect. Sometimes people told her that she shouldn't put them in her shop window, but she just shrugged and said it was her shop, and if people didn't like that, they could stick it where the sun don't shine. Nothing with a smile like that can be hateful, she'd say. If we helped around the shop, we could play with any toy we'd liked, but only one. I don't really know how much we helped, but Mama Jane would let us play with something from her shop almost every day. There was an unspoken code about it, something of a ritual. We wouldn't pick anything that looked like it would break, and Mama Jane would let us stay in the shop for as long as we liked, providing we didn't bother customers. This was an easy rule to follow, as there usually weren't any. People did bring things to Mama Jane, though. And one particular day, a tall Jamaican man with dreadlocks dangling over his shoulder brought a walnut-colored box into the shop. I know he was Jamaican, because whenever someone from Jamaica came into the shop, Mama Jane's accent would intensify to the point where a 7-year-old Liverpoolian girl could no longer gain any meaning. I was playing with my favorite vintage doll, a horrific sun-bleached thing that I called Tabitha, and Jacob was playing with his train, driving it along the stained carpet enthusiastically. "Watch the shop, children," Mama Jane called behind her as she and the man disappeared into the back to talk business. After a while, they came back, talking quietly amongst themselves. I could tell Mama Jane was excited. The man's box was gone, and as he had left the shop, Mama Jane locked the door, turned the open sign to closed, then burst into gleeful laughter, stomping her feet and swaying from side to side. "What'd you get today, Mama?" Jacob asked. "Oh, child," she said, clapping her hands together. "Come see." We both placed our toys back carefully on their respective shelves. Abandoning a toy meant you did not want it, Mama always claimed, then followed her into the back of the shop. This in itself was something of a rare treat, and her excitement was infectious, even without me or Jacob knowing what exactly we were excited about. Inside her back office, on her desk, was the dark wooden box. Now I could see it properly. About the size of 2 book bags, stacked on top of each other, it was locked tight with 2 brass clamps. Mama Jane brushed her hand along the walnut lid and looked down at us. "Do you believe in magic, children?" she asked in a whisper. Her wide eyes made me nod without even really thinking about the question. "Magic's for kids," said Jacob defiantly. That what you think, is it?" said Mama, her voice purring. She snapped one clasp open, then the other, pausing with her hand on the lid. She met our eyes and drank us in. I realized I was leaning so far forward I was close to toppling on my face. Whatever Mama was thinking, she decided to proceed, and lifted the lid. Jacob stood on tiptoes to peer inside, but I was too short to see. All I could see was the green velvet interior of the lid, and Mama Jane carefully lowered her hands inside the box. She was so tender, lifting the contents out. At first I thought it was a newborn baby. As I got my first look, I found myself disappointed. It was just a plain doll made out of a Hessian sack. It had black button eyes and a stitched-on smile made from black thread. It didn't have hands, hair, or any clothing. I couldn't see why Mama Jane was so excited about this boring doll until she placed it down. Rather than crumbling to the floor like every other doll I'd ever seen, it remained upright as Mama Jane took her hands away. Even though it was bent forwards, with its arms almost touching the carpet, it didn't fall over. Even my childlike grasp of physics told me this was strange, though I didn't understand why. Then it began to move. It lifted its Hessian arms and straightened, standing completely upright. When it clapped its little stumps together, Mama Jane started laughing in her great, big, booming way that meant something was truly delighting her. We'd seen puppets before, but they had strings. It was a game that we chose to play along with. This was something else. This was real magic. I was so enraptured with the moving doll, it took me a moment to notice that Mama Jane was clapping in time with it. When each of its Hessian hands joined together, a clap would sound from above me. At first, I thought she was copying it, but then, as I glanced from one to the other, I realized it was the other way around. The doll was copying Mama Jane's movements. Perfectly, as though they were twins. "What is it?" I asked. "How does it work?" asked Jacob. Mama Jane just laughed and began walking around the room. The little doll did the same. As they moved, it almost looked like a synchronized dance routine. She jumped in the air, and the doll leapt off the floor in a mirror image, landing back on its feet with ease. We both applauded in sheer, childish glee. "I want to go," said Jacob. Mama Jane leant over to him and wagged a finger. On the floor, the doll wiggled a stumpy limb. "It's not so easy, child," said Mama. Jacob scrunched up his face, eyes locked on the doll. Mama Jane ruffled his hair, and the doll reached into empty space to do the same. "What's its name?" I asked. "You don't have a name yet." That seemed a little sad to me. I waved at him to say hello. Mama Jane waved into empty space, and the doll copied her. Even though I knew Mama was doing it, I was impressed how much it looked like the doll was truly waving at me. Its button eyes were staring right at me. Mama seemed less impressed, though, and snatched up the doll, placed him inside the box, and clasped it shut so quickly I almost didn't believe it had happened. She rested over the box for quite a long time, long enough for me and Jacob to share a worried look. When Mama Jane turned around, she had stopped smiling, and her cheeks had gone pale. "I don't want you to tell nobody about this, you hear?" she said. We both nodded frantically. It wasn't like we had anyone to tell besides each other. "Run along now," she said, scuttling us out of the back office. We said goodbye, but Mama Jane didn't say it back. The door to the office slammed shut behind us and was promptly locked. Me and Jacob went upstairs, excitedly babbling to each other about the doll and what we would make it do when we had our turns. I began thinking of names for the doll, but Jacob didn't like any of my suggestions. Our real mother didn't come home that night, and I woke up a few times to Jacob accidentally jabbing me with a knee or elbow as he tossed and turned in the night. I remember opening my eyes to see him barely visible in the darkness, staring up at the ceiling. "You okay?" I asked. "I don't get how it works." "Mama said it was magic," I replied, closing my eyes again. "Magic's not real," Jacob said in a grumpy voice, throwing himself onto his side. That night I dreamt of dancing dolls, vintage Victorian ones with rippling dresses, Barbies all box fresh and pretty, Goily Doilies and Cabbage Patch Kids, all holding hands in a huge circle and twirling, twirling, twirling. At the center of it all, the Hessian doll, with his button eyes and stitched-on smile. I woke to Jacob nudging me. He already had his shoes on, and he was shoving mine in my face. "Come on," he said, leaping up and holding the door open for me. Still rubbing sleep from my eyes, I started walking towards Miss Cooper's flats, but Jacob pulled my arm and whirled me towards the staircase. "But I'm hungry," I moaned, grabbing my belly dramatically. "We'll get food later," said Jacob. It was difficult to keep up with him that morning. He leapt downstairs and ran across the halls, stopping and waiting for me whenever he went too far. He grinned like a Cheshire cat when the back door to Mama Jane's shop opened, and we crept inside. Mama was polishing shelves and looked up at us as we entered. "Good Lord, children, you out here early today. I'm thinking you be wanting something." She chuckled to herself and threw her duster over her shoulder. "Have you got chores for us, Mama?" Jacob asked. I watched him closely. We did chores, sure, but we never asked for them, especially not Jacob. He was up to something. It didn't pass Mama Jane's notice either. She narrowed her eyes at us. That what you both want, is it? I looked down at the floor, instinctually trying to look small and pitiful. I want food, I said in a small voice. She let out a disapproving That was the sound she often made when we discussed our mother, either directly or indirectly. She held out her hand and led me through the back. As we walked away, she called to Jacob over her shoulder. You clean the windows then, boy. Keep going until you see your face in them. Mama Jane didn't make us food very often, but I was hoping for a bit of lamb patty she'd shared with us once. No such luck on that day, though. I just got jam on toast. She picked me up and let me sit on the counter of our makeshift kitchen, humming to herself as she buttered the toast and spread the jam. I told her of the names I'd thought for the doll, and she said they were pretty. After I'd eaten the last crust that Mama Jane would have never let us eat outside the kitchen, we walked back into the shop. I was ready to do some chores now, if it meant getting to play with the doll again. But as we walked around the shelves, the shop was empty. Where my brother should have been cleaning windows, there were just dingy net curtains and dolls perched on the wooden chairs. Mama Jane walked outside, bell jangling as she looked left and right, but Jacob wasn't there. She came back inside, eyes darting around the shop. I tried looking too, but I couldn't see Jacob anywhere. My eyes fell on the door to the back office, which Mama Jane always kept locked. Mama Jane seemed to have the same idea and walked over to it, testing the handle. It opened. She pushed the door open, and in the center of the room was Jacob, scrambling on his knees. The walnut box was wide open, green velvet insides on show. Jacob was crying and kept turning so we couldn't see what he had in his hands. I just wanted to see how it worked, he said through tears. He turned to us, and stuffing spilled out of his hands onto the floor. There was a small gash in the side of the doll, and Jacob's pocket knife lay on the floor, still open. I began crying too. Mama Jane moved over to Jacob, but as she moved, the doll stayed still. I charged towards Jacob and shoved him as hard as I could. You killed him, I cried, eyes stinging so badly I couldn't even see my brother. He didn't even have a name yet. Mama Jane said nothing, and as I wiped away my tears on a sleeve, I saw Jacob only had eyes for her, fearfully waiting for her reaction. We'd never seen Mama Jane angry, not really. She was a woman who would give a hint of what her anger could feel like, and that made you never want to prod further. In that moment, I became afraid too. Afraid that we'd lose our second home. Afraid that we'd lose Mama. She plucked the doll from Jacob's hands and carried it over to her desk without saying a word. Mama calmly scooped up the stuffing pieces from the floor. The only sound was Jacob's choked sobs and my sniffles. Once every piece was on the table, she gazed down at the doll, shook her head and muttered something under her breath. Then she buried her head in her hands and said, "This is a very bad thing you've done, Jacob." It was the first time I'd ever heard her call either of us by name. We were always child or children. Mama Jane began to cry, and to our complete surprise, she turned and wrapped both of us into a tight hug. "I'm really sorry, Mama," whispered Jacob. "Can you fix him?" Still clutching one another, we walked over to the desk and stared at the unmoving doll. He looked so sad now, half deflated with his insides missing. "I'm not sure I should, Jacob," said Mama Jane, clamping hold of my arm and squeezing tight. "Some things in this world aren't to be toyed with." Nodding to herself, Mama released us both and began to pull out the rest of the doll's stuffing. Once there was nothing left, she placed the doll back inside its walnut box and closed the lid. She placed it high on a bookshelf that even she could barely reach and gathered up the stuffing into a pile. "I'm sorry, Mama," said Jacob again. "Run along now, children," she said, without looking at us. We skulked out without another word, walked back up into the flats, and spent the rest of the day skulking in our bedsit. Our own mother came home that night, quite late, collapsed without a word at the side of us onto the mattress. I waited until she fell asleep, then cuddled her arm. Mornings with Mother were terribly quiet. We would wait to see what mood she was in, creeping around and whispering. At the time, it just seemed like a game to me. It seems considerate not to wake her. I realize now Jacob was doing it to extend the time we had where she wasn't awake. The sirens ruined that. Police, ambulance, more police. Something bad had happened, and our mother was convinced we should stay inside until they went away. Me and Jacob peeked through the curtains, watching the street below, but we couldn't see anything other than the tops of cars and people gawking at our building. Eventually, anyone in uniform left, and our flat returned to normality. We could leave, and our mother was first to do so. Me and Jacob visited some neighbors, but kept inside the halls, too afraid to go back to Mama Jane's so soon. Miss Cooper made us peanut butter sandwiches and taught us how to tell the time, or tried to, at least. We asked her what had happened with the police, but she said we didn't need to worry about that. The next day we tried to visit Mama Jane, and our door was locked and covered with tape. It said police on it, but neither me or Jacob really knew what that meant. We went outside and tried to go to the front door, but that was locked too. It would be 2 more days before we found out Mama Jane was dead. Murdered, our mother said. Our neighbors had spared us all the gruesome details, but we persisted our mother until she spilled every last drop. Someone had stabbed her to death. They tried to make it look like suicide, but it was too obvious. They'd cut her open, then put the knife in her hands. I cried myself to sleep that night. Jacob refused to lie down and curled up in a ball near the corner of the room. Our mother got sick of our whining and left in the middle of the night. She said Mama Jane was a bitch anyway, and probably got what was coming to her. I didn't believe that. I think that was the night any love for my mother began to unravel for me. She said a lot of nasty things that night. Things I don't truly remember, but I remember how it made me feel. Days passed and we began to hear more details. Mama Jane hadn't just been stabbed, she'd been disemboweled. Her intestines had been pulled all over the floor and parts of them were missing. When we heard that, we crept downstairs the same night, and Jacob showed me a trick with a pocket knife, a debit card, and a door lock. I'd never been inside Mama Jane's shop in the darkness, and everything about it took on a dark tilt without her in the world. I clutched hold of Jacob as we made our way towards the office, where Jacob repeated his trick. Inside the room, I noticed the only thing different about the shop, other than no light and no Mama, the carpet. A huge rectangle of carpet had been cut up and removed, just beneath the desk. Just beneath the desk. At the time, it had baffled us. Now I know that was where she had died. Of course, there was only one thing we wanted to check. One suspicion we couldn't let lie. Together, we moved the chair and the desk, and Jacob climbed on top to reach the walnut box. As soon as he placed it down and ran his thumbs along the clasps, I wanted to leave. I wanted to forget the whole thing. I missed Mama, and I couldn't bring her back. I was just a little girl, but I knew nothing good could come of this. But I couldn't stop Jacob. He snapped open the clasps and threw back the lid. The doll was still inside, but it was whole again. The gash Jacob had made had been stitched back together. Its stuffing was back, apparently. "Maybe Mama fixed it," I hissed, creeping towards the door. Jacob clearly wasn't happy with that explanation, and he reached into the box to pick up the doll. As he did, it squelched. I had no comparison as a child, but it was the sound that raw chicken fillets made if you squeezed them together. Disgusted, Jacob flinched and dropped the doll onto the floor. It twisted in the air, and it landed on its feet with a squishy noise. I didn't know how long we stared at that doll for. Neither of us dared move. When Jacob finally moved to pick up the doll took a step forward too. This made Jacob flinch back, yank his hand away, and the doll copied him on the floor, stumbling back, then raising its little stumps defensively. "Pick it up!" Jacob screamed. I tried to calm him down. We were supposed to be keeping quiet, but my brother was being hysterical. "Pick it up!" he screamed again, his voice high-pitched and terrifying. I did it. I reached down and picked up the little doll. It was moist and soft in my hands. It made that same sickening squelch as I placed it down in its box. Jacob paced around the room, head in his hands, babbling to himself so fast and so quietly I couldn't hear what he was saying. I couldn't take my eyes off the walnut box. It wobbled around as the doll walked into its edges, trying to imitate Jacob's movements in what tiny space it had. I didn't really understand why Jacob was so scared. I was glad the doll was back to normal and alive again. We might have lost Mama, but at least we had the doll. "Did Mama fix you?" I asked him. The doll stopped pacing, looked up at me, and nodded. To my side, Jacob let out a sheer animal yelp of fear. He toppled onto the ground, kicking himself away to curl up against a wall. "It made me move," he cried, lips quivering, tears streaming down his face. "It made me move." I looked inside the box. The doll was imitating Jacob perfectly, pushing backwards and shaking with fear. I didn't truly understand. I was just a little girl. But my brother's fear was enough to make me close the box and encase the doll in darkness. Without knowing what to say, I did the only thing I knew how and curled up next to my brother, hugging his arm as he cried like a baby. He was always the strong one, always the protector who knew what to do next. God knows I didn't. We must have sat together like that for a long time. Eventually, he composed himself and said, "We need to hide it somewhere." He stood up, sliding free from my grip, and nodded to himself. "We need to hide it somewhere. Nobody will ever find it." And he did. Jacob made me stay upstairs in the flat whilst he went out. He'd refused to tell me where he'd go, but he was gone for 3 hours. When he came back, it had just started raining, and his clothes were wet. He didn't say anything as I helped him undress, but when he lay on the mattress, I wrapped the duvet around him, as he had done so many times for me. He met my eyes, and then he smiled. "Love you," he whispered. We fell asleep again. And when I woke up, for the first time in my life, I was alone. No mother, no Jacob. The front door was still ajar. Our singular room had felt small all of my life, but in that moment it felt impossibly large and daunting. I searched the flat for him. I walked the halls. I cried. Miss Cooper eventually rang the police, and I stayed at hers until they arrived. Of course, it didn't take long for a picture to be painted. Missing boy, abandoned girl. I never saw my mother again. Turned out I had an auntie, though. I stopped with them that night, and I never said a word, especially not when I found out Jacob was dead. Years later, I would learn police found him floating face down in the canal. It got recorded as an accidental death, just another kid who ran away from home, slipped into the waters and couldn't climb back out. but I knew the truth. Jacob wouldn't run away, not without me. It had been the doll. Jacob threw him away, so he had thrown Jacob away. Mama Jane had pulled out his insides, so the doll had done the same to her. My auntie had a huge flat, and I got to sleep in the bed while she stayed on the sofa. I had never slept in an actual bed before, but that night I didn't really appreciate the experience. My body clearly did, though. As I fell asleep not long after, my auntie wished me good night and turned off the light. I dreamed that night. A vivid dream that I was walking down a cold, wet street. The glare from the lampposts above me made me want to blink and squint, but for some reason I couldn't, and they were impossibly large, towering over me. One hand was behind me, dragging something. For a long time, I just kept walking, but some numb part of my mind wondered what I was dragging. I turned and met Jacob, staring at me with wide, glassy eyes. He was sat upright, and I was dragging his coffin. It was filled with dark, dirty water up to his shoulders. The sight of it was enough to shock me out of my dream. I wanted to sit upright, throw my covers off, and find my newly discovered auntie, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. Locked in position, all I could do was stare at the ceiling and wonder why it felt like there was ground beneath my feet, even though I was laying down in bed. Then, my arm moved. It's a difficult sensation to describe. It was like cramp or a spasm without the pain. My muscles were moving, but I wasn't in control. I couldn't even try to wrestle with it. I couldn't strain or fight it. I could only watch as my right arm lifted, bending at the elbow. My hand formed a fist, and as though I were knocking on a door, my hand knocked the air. There was the faintest little tap-tap, perfectly in time with my gesture. Then my paralysis melted away, and I was back in control. After flexing my fingers and wiggling my toes, I threw back the covers and looked around the room. Something had made a noise, and I couldn't figure out what it was. I looked under the bed and inside the drawers, opened the cupboard, and climbed the table to search the shelves. As I walked back to the bed, something took hold of me, and my entire body went rigid. Again, my hand made a fist and raised to knock on nothing at all. I let out a little whimper, not wanting to scream and wake up my auntie. As my knuckles rapped on the air once again, I heard the faintest tap-tap. This time, I realized where it was coming from. The window. I was released again, and almost fell to the floor as my muscles struggled to adjust to my sudden regained control. The curtains were drawn over the window, and I made my way over, slowly peeling them back. It was so dark outside it was hard to make anything out, but the dim orange haze from the streetlights at least let me see there was something on the exterior window still. A walnut box, open, and staring through the window at me were two glinting black button eyes. My brother's killer, Mama Jane's killer. The doll had come back for me. How had it got here? Had it been controlling me while I slept? Walking down the dark streets of Liverpool, dragging its wretched box and made me dream of coffins? Dragging its wretched box and making me dream of coffins? We watched each other for a long time. It didn't take control of me. That made me think it was waiting to see what I did. Jacob and Mama Jane had been retaliation for the way they treated it. As quietly as I could, I opened the window and carefully pulled the box through, doll still standing inside. My hands were shaking so much that any normal doll would have shaken too. But even though the walnut box trembled in my hands, the doll stood completely still. The doll was drenched from rainwater, and with the window shut, I could almost feel the stench rising upward. I lowered until our eyes were inches apart, then kissed him softly on the top of his Hessian head. It was wet on my lips, and the smell was unbearable. "Good night, Mr. Buttons," I whispered. Picking the doll up, I laid him tenderly down in his box, trying my best to ignore the squelching, and found a little dust cloth to wrap around him like a bedsheet. Closing the box, I hid it under a few papers in one of my auntie's drawers. I went to bed, but didn't sleep. By the end of the next day, when nothing bad had happened, I repeated my actions of the previous night. Open the box, take out Mr. Buttons, wish him good night, tuck him in, close the box. The kissing was the hardest part, and the smell, but I'd hold my nose and keep a tissue to wipe my lips. When it kept working, I kept doing it. I've done it every night since Jacob's death. On Christmas Eve, after nights out with friends, my wedding night, I still do it to this day. Jacob's birthday is always the hardest, but I don't even need to force myself to do it anymore. In fact, I think it will feel strange to stop. I never told anyone about any of this because even as a child I knew nobody would believe me. But now my husband has found the box. We want children soon. But what if they find it one day? It's too horrible to even think about. I've been trying to decide what to do all day, but my mind is finally made up. Jacob and Mama hurt the doll, but they didn't destroy it. It only took revenge after they'd done something to it. But if I destroy it, completely and utterly remove it from this world, it wouldn't be able to take its retribution against me. That's my plan, anyway. If it doesn't know what I'm planning, it won't be able to get revenge. But I don't know how any of this works. I never have. I have to try. For my husband. For my future children. Tonight, I'm going to kiss the doll goodnight, as I always do. I'm going to tuck him in and close the box. I'm going to wait for my husband to fall asleep and creep downstairs. And then I'm going to burn that fucking box with the doll inside. I'll wait until it's nothing but ashes, and then I'll pour more petrol on the flames. I'll watch it burn all night. For Jacob. For Mama. I'm going to end this horrible doll once and for all. Good night, Mr. Buttons. With so much time on my hands, I suppose I should tell you the whole story, and start it where it should be started, at the beginning. When I was young, and I mean roughly 5 or 6 years old, I thought it was my imagination. The voices speaking in sinister tones were nothing more than the sounds of my young conscience. I thought they kept me safe and helped me understand what I should be doing to keep up with my friends since they were all I had. See, I was an only child, raised in a home where my parents did what they had to keep me alive, but they never really wanted me. So they gave me a room and food and drink, basically just what they were required to that would keep DHS from showing up. But they never played with me or really showed me any affection. I was more like a pet to them, or a houseplant. I barely spent any time in my house, always playing in the woods just beyond our backyard. I would play by myself mostly, but sometimes I would have one of the neighbor kids to play with. We would build forts and set booby traps to keep people out. The trap-making skills of a young child my age was always much more of a concept than any form of actual danger or deterrent, but it did help me pass hours and hours of time as I played alone in the forest. I think my solitude is what brought the voices to me in the first place. As I grew, most of what I learned about the world was from the neighbor kids. Going to school for me was difficult because I could hardly concentrate with the screams and shouting echoing through my head. They always seemed to get louder the farther I got from the woods in my backyard. By the time I turned 10, The dull roar inside my head had turned into actual sentences, and sometimes commands. The voices began to teach me things, and when I didn't understand something, the voices would often explain it. When I first learned that not everyone had the voices, I thought that it was some sort of superpower, that I was somehow more important or special than the other kids, or adults for that matter. The first real problem I had with the voices was when I was 11, and they taught me how to make real traps, ones that were actually dangerous. They instructed me on how to dig a hole and sharpen sticks to put at the bottom, then how to cover it with leaves and twigs so you couldn't see it. I was so proud of myself once I had it complete. I made sure there were only 3 or 4 sharpened sticks at the bottom, but it took a lot of work to scrape them on concrete or rock till they were pointy. A few days went by after I made it, and I had all but forgotten about it, when the voices told me they were bored and that I should see if the neighbor kid wanted to play in the woods with me. To my surprise, the neighbor did. The voices led me into the forest, but even as I followed their commands, I was still confused as to where they were taking me.
Stop!
The echoed yell of the voices boomed through my skull, and I held in place. I stood just curiously looking around, trying to figure out why they had told me to stop here. My friend walked ahead of me, and I suddenly realized where we were as the branches broke and he fell into the pit. I ran to the edge of it and tried to help him out. The voices in my head exploded with laughter when I saw that one of the sharp sticks had pierced the meat of his calf. The other sticks looked like they had long before fallen over, and thus were thankfully completely ineffective. My friend howled in pain as blood began to run down his leg. In a near sense of panic, I jumped down the 3-ish feet to the bottom and helped him out of the hole. I didn't really know what to do at that age, so I left the stick in and helped him hobble back to his house, where his parents called an ambulance. The voices couldn't stop laughing in my head for nearly an hour, and his parents were extremely mad, but I never was completely sure who they were mad at. I didn't know if they were mad at me for taking him out there or him for being out in the woods screwing around like that. I do know that he was never allowed to play with me in the forest again. After that, the voices began asking me to do more things that I didn't really care to do. They would either find a way to trick me into doing it or hound me inside my mind until I gave in and did whatever they were commanding. They began small, simple things that were easy to talk me into because it felt almost like typical childhood playing, like burning bugs and ants with a magnifying glass. The ants always smelled so badly when they burned. Sometimes they would find a way for me to play that was a little more unorthodox, like finding a dead bird and hitting it with a baseball bat, like some sort of cruel and demented home run derby. Those games I never would have thought to play on my own, but the voices always made it seem like it would be just fun enough to make me feel like I was playing a sport like the other kids. The voices would howl with laughter each time, and I would smile, feeling like I was making someone happy or, in a sense, proud of me. As I could imagine when my interests, if you could even call them that, were activities like playing with dead birds and burning insects, that I was very quickly losing friends, or, in the very least, I wasn't making any new ones. This led to a rather lonely childhood. Yet, I still did have a few friends that I would play with on occasion, but for the most part, the only thing that ever kept me company were the voices in my head. When I grew into my mid-teens, the voices took more shape. I mean this in 2 different aspects. The first being that the voices slowly melded together into one deep, echoed voice, almost like a large group of raspy, deep-voiced old men saying the same sentence at the same time, only their timing had gotten better. The other aspect was that now the voices truly had a shape, and by that, I mean they had become the blurry shadow behind me in the mirror, or the distorted figure reflecting in the ripples of a puddle. It followed me wherever I went now, just hiding at the periphery of my vision, lurking just out of focus, taunting me, guiding me. They always seemed to be just over my shoulder, touching me, yet I could feel nothing. It was like that voice in the back of your mind, except mine had a much stronger and more malevolent opinion on everything around me. When I got my first job at the age of 14, I saved my little heart out so I could buy a car when I hit 16. I knew my parents weren't going to help me, other than the food and shelter they provided. I basically raised myself. Come to think of it, if it weren't for the guidance of the voices in my head, I'm not entirely sure I would have made it this far. When I hit 15, my voices started demanding that I do things that, if I think about it now, would be what I would call sacrifices. They pressured and begged and threatened to make my life a living hell with unrelenting screaming inside my skull, until I finally relented. At first, the offerings were small. I felt like it was a way for them to ease me into the idea of fulfilling these horrible requests that I had no desire to complete. They started by having me catch frogs or other small palm-sized animals and mutilate them or torture them to death. I could feel my own sanity begin to crack as horrible suggestions screamed through my head with each animal I found.
Throw it in a blender.
The voices would say, following it with malicious laughter.
Put it in a Tupperware container and watch it cook in the hot sun.
Another would echo through my mind. I never thought any of the poor animals deserved it. A few times I would yell back at them, resisting and announcing that I was in control and for them to shut up. However, if I didn't do what they asked, no matter how much I refused, they would begin to scream in my mind until I was driven insane. Not being able to escape their incessant screaming, I would finally relent and follow their orders, for nothing more than to make the screaming stop. Each time I relented, and as soon as I completed their gruesome tasks, they would roar with laughter for hours, commenting and making jokes about whatever poor creature they had just made me torture before finally leaving me alone for another week or so. At this point, I no longer believed that they were my superpower. I no longer believed that they were trying to help me. No longer thought that they made me feel special in any way, but instead knew that I was being haunted by something. Some malevolent force that I wasn't truly sure what it wanted. As things escalated, not only did I question what it wanted, but also why it had chosen me to put through this psychological torture. A week after I turned 16, I got the car that I had saved so hard for. It was an older Toyota Corolla, and I knew that it wasn't much, but it was mine, and it ran well enough to get me around. It was another well-deserved sense of freedom that I had not experienced before. As I drove through the streets in my town, the shadow remained in my rearview mirror. It had been silent for months now, but it never left the edges of my vision. I was never truly alone. Its presence was always there, just looking over my shoulder, whispering into my ear, suggesting various things as I tried to go about my day. None of it was ever anything helpful anymore. Always malicious, always sadistic, and forever begging for that next sacrifice to it. Sadly, and suddenly, a small white dog ran into the road. I hit the brakes and began to swerve around it when the voices interrupted in my head, startling me as the force spoke to me for the first time in so long.
Hit it.
The voices screamed through my mind so loud I had to wince in pain. What? Hell no, I thought as I continued braking.
Do it now.
The voices boomed in a much deeper and much more demonic pitch than the first time.
We will not command again. Hit it now. We demand it.
No, I won't do it, I shouted out louder into my rearview mirror in an empty car. I knew it heard me. It always heard me, even when I wasn't saying things out loud.
Hit it, hit it, hit it. Do it now.
It yelled over and over, sounding like a choir of infinite voices demanding the same hellish command. "No!" I cried out, only causing them to get angrier and louder as they repeated the order. I yelled out in agony as my foot slipped from the brake and mashed the gas pedal. I cried as the thud sounded and the car bounced with the dog rolling beneath the tires. The voices rang out in a cacophony of sadistic laughter in my head and abruptly stopped and went silent again. Tears welled in my eyes as I looked in the rear view to see the dog's lifeless body lay in the street. I saw it only for a second before my view was obscured as the dark shadow formed in my rearview mirror. It had become much clearer now, and as it formed, I noticed that for the first time it had a face. Sinister and dark, smiling far wider than made sense, and the eyes held evil in them to the likes I had never seen. I quickly trained my eyes back on the road, and through the silence in my tear-filled eyes, I turned and headed back home. After that, I tried my best to continue fighting the voices and the figure, but it just brought on more cunning ways to gain its sacrifices. With each one, it gained more of a presence and more clarity in my world and in my life. I would come outside to start my car for school, only to find that it had lured a cat into the engine. The start of my car would kill the cat, forcing me to murder it with no option to fight the sadistic orders. I no longer had a choice. It just set up scenarios that would get it its sacrifice without me having a chance to refuse. I had become nothing more than a vessel, just an engine for the demon's sick and twisted game. It was hell-bent on some grand plan, some behind-the-scenes goal that I was unaware of. Once I was in tune with the voices, they helped me survive my early childhood, but now I was no longer in control, and the voices just used me to interact with things in my world. People and animals were mere playthings to the demon, and it had decided that the only way to rip the heads off the dolls was to use my body and my arms to do it. This continued as I made my way into college. My friends and roommates all thought it was just that I had the worst of luck, but I couldn't correct them. I couldn't let them know the constant turmoil raging beneath my skin. I was constantly surrounded by death, traps and situations that had been set up for me to fall into, but ultimately ended with it appearing to be my doing. The demon had gained so much power over me, and I was completely helpless to stop it. I could barely recognize myself when I looked in the mirror anymore. The person I was as a kid was no longer the person I am now. To myself, I felt like I looked emaciated, gaunt. It looked like I had a life filled with beatings and starvation. However, it was always hard to see myself in the mirror clearly, because the demon no longer stood over my shoulder or behind me. When I look in the mirror, I see my own sad and weak form, but the demon is now a faded overlay in the reflection. With each new death, my reflection fades as his gains more opacity. I don't know if he is the replacement me or if we are melding together to become the same being, but there is nothing I can do to stop it. My next big turning point was during my senior year of college. I had been lured into the woods near campus by the voices. I fought them the whole time in my head, and with every step, but I could no longer get my body to respond to how much I didn't want to go. The darkness of the night had no effect or meaning to the voices as they walked my puppet of a body deeper into the woods until I came to a clearing. In front of me sat a group of other college students, none of which I knew from classes I had. 3 girls and 2 guys sat around a small campfire as I stumbled into the clearing, still trying to resist what the demon was making me do.
Perfect,
the grumble of voices said as I saw the people. It followed me with a soft, sinister chuckle inside my head. "Please, leave," I said as I got closer to the campfire, trying to do my best to prevent whatever the demon was planning. "What? Who the fuck are you?" one of the guys said, confused and offended at my sudden order. "Yeah, I don't think so, buddy. Why don't you get the fuck out of here?" said the other guy with heavy sarcasm and a false sense of confidence, just as my body had entered their circle around the campfire. He may have been trying to mask it, but it was obvious he was just trying to look tough in front of the 3 girls they were with. "Please, just go. I don't want to do this," I cried out to them, my voice filled with pain and regret. A deep, sinister laugh began to build in my mind, and the voices began to speak again.
"Kill, kill, kill, kill."
A chant rose in the background while the main voice of the demon began speaking.
"I require their blood. You can get it for me willingly, or I will force you to take it. But it will be mine."
Horror flashed in my eyes at the sound of this command, and I could tell that the people around the campfire could see it. I stood stunned, still fighting with every fiber of my being, just trying to avoid this situation. I just wanted to go back home, to keep to myself, go to bed. I wanted to become a hermit and live where I couldn't hurt anyone or anything anymore. All these thoughts raced around in my mind as the sinister laughter and chanting began to echo louder in my ears. "Yo, what the fuck is your problem, bro? Get out of here," the first guy said to me. He broke my train of thought as he did his best to try and establish dominance over the situation. "Ew, what's his deal? Is he some sort of perv?" one of the girls said to the other 2 in a whiny, annoying tone. Just then, the torture from the voices screaming in my head became too much, and my mind broke. My eyes glazed over, and the demon began to laugh loudly in my skull. I ran to the fire and pulled a burning log from it, smashing the first guy in the face, catching his beard on fire, and knocking him out cold at the same time. Moving with speed and strength I had never before possessed, I ran to the girl who had spoken and lifted her out of her seat by her throat, crushing her windpipe. I tossed her onto the fire, and her clothes quickly caught and began to burn. The other guy broke from his shock and ran to me, swinging his fists, slamming them into my head and stomach, but to my surprise, having no effect. I grabbed him by the throat and headbutted him, crushing his skull and sending blood spatter over my face. I then dropped his suddenly lifeless body, letting it slump to the ground like nothing more than a loose sack of meat. An animalistic roar erupted from my throat, a sound I didn't even think was possible for me to make. The other 2 girls began to scramble as the surprise and shock wore off. I grabbed one by the leg and swung her into the other, knocking them both on the ground. I dove my hand into the stomach of one of the girls. My fingers tore through her flesh into her insides. My fingers wrapped around the inside of her ribcage, and I threw her against a tree. A loud crack sounded as her spine shattered and her body fell to the ground. The last girl did her best to crawl away, her leg broken from being thrown by it into the other girl. I slowly walked towards her as an unusually large grin began to form on my face. "Who the fuck are you?" the girl said. Her voice was so full of terror it was hard to even understand her words. I walked over her and knelt by her face, my eyes still glazed over in solid black. A voice that was no longer my own came from my throat.
"I am everything."
The demon shouted through me as I raised my foot and slammed it down on the woman's skull, crushing it against a rock. Another howl and roar emitted from my chest, and the voices screamed with laughter and cheering. An eruption of glowing embers looking like a firework showered around me as I was hit in the back with a burning log. I quickly turned to see that the first guy had regained consciousness. The glaze in his still focusing eyes and his singed and half-missing beard told me that he wasn't fully sure of what had or was happening around him. As I turned and saw him, the demon began to laugh through me. a deep and billowing laugh at this man's feeble attempt to take me down. I could feel the hot, rage-filled blood course through my veins as I took 2 steps towards him and kicked him in the center of the chest. The man flew back and hit a tree before sliding down and onto the ground at the base of it. A final roar exploded from my chest as I stepped on his leg. My thumb pierced into his eye sockets as my fingers pressed into his mouth. As I gripped the roof of his mouth, I gave an effortless tug and pulled his head from his body. Veins still dripped, while tendons and muscle tissue dangled from the bottom of his neck. The muscles in his body instantly relaxed, and his torso slid over and toppled onto the ground. I tossed the head into the fire, and the choir of voices laughed and screamed with excitement. Slowly, I walked back to my apartment. When I got there, I did nothing more than take a shower and pass out on the bed. The demon's bloodlust seemed to subside for the rest of that school year. The authorities chalked it up to an aggressive bear attack because they could come up with no better excuse for the ferocity and strength needed to inflict some of the damage. I dropped out of college at the end of that year and decided to move out west into the hills and forest. Being in college kept me around too many people and too many opportunities for the demon to satisfy his urges for death. On my road trip to move was the final moment of control. I had stopped at an overlook in the mountains in Arizona. In my car were any and all my possessions in life, so I decided to drive around in a very erratic path across the country. I had gone up to Montana and then down to Arizona, and I figured that my ultimate destination would be somewhere in the woods of Wyoming or Oregon. As I stood at the edge, looking over the cliff of the overlook, contemplating if I should continue my plans so I could have some form of life, or if I should stop the demon from taking full control and throwing myself over the edge. The hairs on the back of my neck began to tingle, and just as I began to notice it, a Jeep pulled up to the overlook behind me. 4 college-age guys that looked to be football players. You know, muscular, athletic builds, either blonde or frosted-tip dye jobs, very boy-bandish, got out and immediately began to be obnoxious. 2 of them began running back and forth, passing a football to each other, while the other 2 opened beers out of a cooler and walked to the edge of the overlook, bragging about some frat party or something of the sort that they had recently been to. It started off soft, but quickly boomed and echoed in my mind. The voice that I so dreaded spoke again for the first time since the campfire.
Them,
was all it said. 1 word, 1 time. I knew what it wanted me to do, but instead I chose to walk to my car and leave. I didn't want to kill or hurt anyone else. As I got close to my car, one of the guys came barreling past me and dove onto my car to catch the football. When he hit the car, he left a huge dent and cracked my rear window.
Hey!
The demon's angry voice exploded from my throat before I could even react. Whoa, look at you little fuck. What are you gonna do about it? I felt my own rage build inside me along with the demon's lust for violence. Blinded by my own anger, it started to feel powerful. I'm ashamed to admit it, but I almost started to like how strong and invincible it made me feel. Please don't. Just leave me alone so nobody gets hurt, I finally said, still holding on to the hope that I could just leave without letting the demon get any stronger than it already was. Oh wow, leave me alone, he repeated me, mocking my words. Chad, look, I think this little bitch is gonna start crying. Chad let out a chuckle and started walking over. The other 2 just sipped at their beers and watched from the edge of the overlook about 20 feet away.
End them, or I will. Now.
The demon screamed inside my skull. "No, please. I won't do it," I said out loud, responding to the voices in my head. "What? You won't do what?" the guy began to say, then shoved my shoulder, nearly knocking me to the ground before finishing his taunt. "Yeah, that's right. You won't do shit, you little bitch." Chad had made it within 15 feet from us when the demon spoke again.
"Fine."
The single word, so simple but carried so much weight, so much meaning with it as it echoed through my mind. The guy went to shove me again, and just as he touched my shoulder, my own anger clashed with the demon's bloodlust and created a hurricane of power inside my body. The demon began to take me over, but this time was met with absolutely no resistance. My mind, tired of fighting it all these years, finally snapped, and I welcomed its control. My arm shot up, grabbing the man by the throat. Everyone froze in shock, including me, as we watched my own emaciated form suddenly swell. I felt the blood in my veins pulse with heat as I watched my virtually muscleless body transform in a brief second to look like I ate 3 meals a day consisting of nothing but steroids and protein shakes. "What the fuck?" I heard Chad say as he began to run towards me. The other two grabbed the bottles they were holding as clubs and began to run towards me as well. I watched as the sudden fear swelled in the man's eyes and a grin grew on my face. Suddenly I spun, throwing the man by his throat through the air, snapping his neck and crashing into Chad, knocking them both to the ground. One of the other guys threw his bottle at me while they ran towards me, but it missed and shattered on the ground near my car. A demonic roar exploded from my chest as my eyes blacked over, and I released any last semblance of control I had. The one still holding the bottle swung it at me, and it connected and shattered across my face. I kicked him in the chest, sending him to the ground and sliding along the gravel on his back. Chad got up and began to run towards me. Blows connected as one of the guys swung at me with all his might. I grabbed both arms and kicked him in the chest, ripping both arms from his body and sending sprays and acres of blood through the air. I swung one of the arms around as I spun just as Chad got within reach, and it connected with his head and sent spatters of blood across his face and body as he fell to the ground. The now armless man remained conscious and lied screaming in pain as the others stood up. He ran towards me and attempted some form of jump kick, but I caught his leg and spun, releasing him and sending him flying towards the edge of the overlook. His body slowly spun upside down in the air before his head and neck caught the brick wall edge, causing his suddenly limp body to cartwheel in the other direction as he continued off the cliff. "What the fuck?" Chad began, but was cut short as I grabbed the back of his head and slammed it into the ground with such force his skull shattered and caved in. I picked up Chad's now lifeless body and threw it at their Jeep. The vehicle rocked and nearly lifted 2 of the tires off the ground with the force of the impact. Next, I walked to the first guy and swung him by his leg onto the side of the Jeep. The lifeless ragdoll body slumped into the lap of Chad's body after it made impact with the Jeep. Finally, I walked to the armless man, slowly bleeding out and screaming in pain. Laughter erupts from the background choir of voices in my head at the sound of the man screaming. I lean down next to the man and see nothing but pure, unbridled terror in his eyes as he looks at me. "Why?" is all the man could get out through sputtered breathing. A huge, billowing laugh explodes from my throat in the man's terrified face, and I grab the man by the throat and toss him over the edge of the overlook and off the cliff. Eventually, I found a cabin in the woods. I won't say where, don't need anyone trying to find me. My physique never returns to its weak state that it was in before the overlook. My eyes never returns to normal either. My skin has also begun to take on a dark tint, but That could just be because of how much time I've spent outside in the sun lately. Now, when I look in the mirror, I no longer see a demon reflected over me, because now I am the demon, and he is me, and we are everything.